The 911 call came in at 6:52 p.m. Armed men, multiple hostages, Riverside Apartments, Building C. SWAT was 20 minutes out, police negotiators were tied up with another crisis, and every second meant lives hanging in the balance. But there was someone already inside the building. Someone the gunman had dismissed as harmless. Someone whose training had prepared him for exactly this moment. Welcome to Stories from Us. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden warriors and life-saving heroism, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These moments matter more than you know. Daniel "Danny" Rodriguez had been delivering food across the city for 3 years, starting each shift at 4 p.m. and working until the restaurants closed, carrying bags of Chinese takeout, pizza boxes, and burger orders up countless flights of stairs in apartment buildings where elevators rarely worked and tips were often disappointingly small. He drove a red Honda Civic with over 200,000 miles on it, wore the same black polo shirt and red baseball cap every day, and had become as invisible to most customers as the street signs they passed without reading. Danny was 35 years old, medium height, with dark hair that was starting to show gray at the temples and hands that bore the calluses of manual labor. He had a friendly smile that he offered to every customer, though most never bothered to make eye contact long enough to see it. There was something in his posture that suggested discipline, in his movements that hinted at training most delivery drivers never received. But in a world where people barely acknowledged service workers, these details went unnoticed. Most customers treated him with the casual indifference reserved for people performing jobs they considered beneath notice. They complained when he was 5 minutes late, questioned why their order took so long to prepare, and frequently reduced or eliminated tips for infractions that had nothing to do with his performance. Some didn't even look up from their phones when answering the door, treating him like an automated delivery system rather than a human being trying to make an honest living. But Danny never complained, never lost his temper, never responded to rudeness with anything other than professionalism. He had learned patience in places where impatience could get you killed, developed the ability to remain calm in situations far more stressful than dealing with difficult customers. Most people assumed his quiet demeanor came from resignation or lack of ambition. They couldn't have been more wrong. What absolutely no one in Danny's current life knew, what no customer who had ever opened a door to receive their food could have imagined, was that Daniel Rodriguez wasn't his real name. His actual identity was Lieutenant Commander Daniel "Razor" Ramirez, and for 12 years he had served with Navy SEAL Team 6, participating in some of the most classified and dangerous operations in modern military history. Razor Ramirez had been the kind of SEAL that other SEALs talked about in whispers, a natural leader who combined tactical brilliance with an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under the most extreme pressure. He'd led 47 successful missions across 3 different theaters of operation, specializing in hostage rescue, counterterrorism, and direct action operations where the margin for error was measured in milliseconds and the cost of failure was always human life. His reputation had been built on a specific type of mission that most special operations forces avoided when possible: urban hostage rescue in contested environments. While other operators preferred the clarity of combat missions against military targets, Razor had developed an expertise in the complex, morally ambiguous world of saving innocent lives from situations where every decision carried the potential for both heroic success and catastrophic failure. The end of his military career hadn't come from injury or forced retirement, but from a choice that had torn him apart. His final mission had been a school hostage situation in Afghanistan, where terrorist operatives had taken over 200 children and teachers hostage in a desperate attempt to force coalition withdrawals from the region. The operation had been technically successful. All hostages rescued, all terrorists neutralized, no civilian casualties. But the psychological cost of operating in an environment where children's lives hung in the balance of every tactical decision had finally broken something inside him that 12 years of combat hadn't touched. PTSD, survivor's guilt, and an inability to reconcile the violence of his professional life with his desire to protect innocent people had led to his decision to leave the military and disappear into civilian anonymity. Food delivery had been a random choice, a job that required no background checks, no references, no questions about why someone with his obvious intelligence and physical capabilities was willing to work for minimum wage plus tips. The work had become a form of therapy, providing structure and purpose without the life or death pressure that had defined his military service. Every delivery was a small mission with clear objectives and measurable success. Every satisfied customer was a tiny victory that didn't require weapons or violence. For 3 years, he'd convinced himself that this simple life was enough, until that Tuesday evening when his two worlds collided in the most unexpected way. Danny had just picked up Mrs. Chen's regular order from Golden Dragon Chinese restaurant. Sweet and sour chicken, no vegetables, extra rice, delivered every evening at exactly 6:47 p.m. to apartment 4B in the Riverside complex. Mrs. Chen was one of his favorite customers, an elderly Chinese woman who always tipped exactly $2, thanked him in broken English, and seemed genuinely pleased to see him every day. In 3 years of deliveries, she had never missed an evening order or failed to be waiting at her door when he knocked. The Riverside apartments were typical of the low-income housing that made up most of his delivery territory. Older buildings with narrow hallways, unreliable elevators, and the kind of thin walls that made everyone's private business uncomfortably public. Building C was particularly run down, with flickering fluorescent lights in the stairwells and a persistent smell of cooking food mixed with industrial disinfectant. Danny climbed the 4 flights of stairs to Mrs. Chen's apartment, carrying her order in one hand and already reaching for his phone with the other to mark the delivery complete. The hallway was unusually quiet. Normally, he could hear televisions, conversations, and the general sounds of life from behind the apartment doors. But tonight, there was an almost oppressive silence that triggered instincts he'd been trying to suppress for 3 years. He knocked on the door of apartment 4B with the same gentle rhythm he'd used hundreds of times before. But when the door opened, it wasn't Mrs. Chen's smiling face that greeted him. It was a young man in his 20s with wild eyes, nervous energy, and most importantly, a pistol held low but ready in his right hand. "Get inside, now," the man said, his voice carrying the kind of forced authority that comes from fear rather than confidence. Danny's SEAL training activated instantly, but he kept his expression neutral and his movements slow and non-threatening. Situational assessment, armed subject, obvious stress indicators, demand for compliance suggesting multiple subjects inside, probable hostage situation, civilian at risk. "Okay, no problem," Danny said calmly, stepping into the apartment while mentally cataloging every detail of the environment and the people in it. The living room was in chaos. Mrs. Chen sat in a corner, her small frame trembling with fear, hands bound with what appeared to be electrical tape. 3 more men occupied the space, all armed, all showing signs of poor operational discipline, nervous movements, weapons held incorrectly, constant checking of windows and doors that indicated they were expecting pursuit rather than conducting a planned operation. The man who had answered the door appeared to be the leader by default rather than training. He was gesturing with his weapon while talking rapidly to one of his companions who was attempting to monitor police scanner traffic on a smartphone app. The third man was positioned by the window, but his attention was divided between watching the street and participating in the increasingly frantic conversation. "What are you doing here?" the leader demanded, turning his attention back to Danny. "Just delivering Mrs. Chen's usual order," Danny replied, holding up the bag of food. "Sweet and sour chicken like every night." "Well, she's not hungry anymore. Get the hell out of here." "Sure, Danny began, but stopped when he saw Mrs. Chen's eyes. She was looking at him with the kind of desperate hope that he'd seen in the faces of hostages before, the look of someone who had given up on rescue but was clinging to any possibility of help. "Wait," said the second gunman, looking up from his phone. "You come here every night?" "Yeah, Mrs. Chen orders the same thing every evening. I've been delivering to her for almost 3 years. Have you seen any cops around? Anyone asking questions about this building?" Danny shook his head. No, nothing unusual, just normal deliveries. The men exchanged glances, and Danny could see them trying to decide whether he was a threat or could be useful. Amateur criminals making decisions based on panic rather than planning, the most dangerous kind because they were unpredictable. You didn't see anything here tonight, the leader said, pointing his weapon more directly at Danny. You deliver the food and leave, and you forget you were ever here. If you talk to anyone about this, the old lady dies. Understand? I understand, Danny said, but he was no longer focused on the conversation. His training had kicked in fully now, and he was conducting the kind of rapid tactical assessment that had kept him alive through dozens of similar situations. 4 armed subjects, 1 civilian hostage, single point of entry/exit, limited cover, poor weapon discipline among the hostiles. More importantly, he was recognizing patterns that told him this situation was going to deteriorate rapidly. These weren't professional criminals conducting a planned operation. They were desperate men who had probably committed a crime elsewhere and were using Mrs. Chen's apartment as a temporary hideout. The police scanner, the constant checking of exits, the nervous energy. They were waiting for something, probably for law enforcement response to cool down so they could escape. But amateurs under pressure made fatal mistakes, and Mrs. Chen was going to pay the price for their poor planning. Danny backed toward the door, keeping his movements slow and his hands visible. I'll just go then. Mrs. Chen, I'll see you tomorrow. The elderly woman nodded slightly, understanding something in his tone that the gunman missed entirely. Danny left the apartment and walked calmly to the stairwell, but instead of leaving the building, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. 911. What's your emergency? Riverside Apartments, Building C, Apartment 4B. Armed hostage situation. At least 4 subjects with firearms. 1 elderly female hostage. Sir, how do you know this information? I'm a food delivery driver. I was just inside the apartment. The hostage is Mrs. Chen. She's in her 70s. How long before SWAT can respond? SWAT team is approximately 20 minutes out. Sir, I need you to maintain safe distance and wait for law enforcement to arrive. Understood, Danny said, but he didn't leave the building. 20 minutes was an eternity in a hostage situation involving panicked amateurs. 20 minutes for them to realize that letting a witness go had been a mistake. 20 minutes for their fear to overcome what little rational thinking they had left. 20 minutes for Mrs. Chen to die because scared men with guns made predictably bad decisions. Danny went to his car and retrieved a small gym bag from the trunk, equipment he'd kept from his military service but had never expected to use again. Tactical knife, zip tie restraints, communication equipment, and other items that most civilians would never recognize, but that could mean the difference between a successful rescue and a tragedy. He re-entered the building through the fire escape, moving with the silent precision that had been drilled into him through thousands of hours of close-quarters combat training. The skills came back as if he'd used them yesterday. Controlled breathing, minimal noise discipline, threat assessment at every corner and doorway. By the time he reached the 4th floor, he could hear the situation inside apartment 4B deteriorating exactly as he'd predicted. Voices were raised, someone was shouting about police response times, and Mrs. Chen was crying softly in the background. Danny positioned himself outside the apartment door and conducted a final assessment. 4 hostiles, 1 civilian, single entry point, element of surprise. The kind of scenario he'd trained for extensively, but had hoped never to face again. But Mrs. Chen was depending on him, and some instincts never fade. The tactical entry was textbook SEAL procedure. Danny moved through the door with the kind of speed and precision that had made him legendary within the special operations community. The first gunman, positioned behind the door, was neutralized with a silent chokehold before he could react. The second, focused on the window, was taken down with a pressure point strike that left him unconscious but alive. The third man, seated at the table with the police scanner, turned just in time to find Danny's tactical knife at his throat and a whispered command to drop his weapon and remain silent. Compliance was immediate and complete. The leader, the man who had first answered the door, was the only one who had time to react, and his reaction was exactly what Danny had expected. He swung his pistol toward Mrs. Chen, using her as a human shield. "Stop right there! I'll kill her!" Danny raised his hands but continued moving, using techniques he'd perfected for exactly this type of situation. "Easy. Nobody needs to get hurt here." "Who are you? You're not just a delivery guy." "You're right," Danny said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that had once commanded respect from the most elite soldiers in the world. "I'm former Navy SEAL Team 6, 12 years of service, specializing in hostage rescue. This is what I do." The gunman's face went pale as he realized he'd made a tactical error that would cost him everything. "Now," Danny continued, "you're going to put down your weapon and step away from Mrs. Chen, because if you don't, I'm going to show you exactly why they called me Razor." The standoff lasted exactly 3 seconds before Danny moved with the lightning precision that had made him legendary among his peers. One fluid motion disarmed the gunman, secured the weapon, and placed the final subject in restraints without injury to the hostage. "It's over, Mrs. Chen," Danny said gently, helping the elderly woman to her feet. "You're safe now." Police sirens were approaching, but the crisis had already been resolved by someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. When SWAT finally arrived, they found 4 suspects in custody, 1 unharmed hostage, and a food delivery driver who had just reminded them that heroes don't always wear uniforms. "Sir, who are you?" the SWAT commander asked as he surveyed the scene. "Lieutenant Commander Daniel Ramirez, retired Navy SEAL Team 6, Danny replied, "currently employed as a food delivery driver." "Razor Ramirez? We've heard the stories, but we thought you'd disappeared." "I did, but Mrs. Chen needed help tonight." Mrs. Chen, despite her trauma, insisted on thanking Danny personally before the paramedics took her for evaluation. "You saved my life," she said, tears in her eyes. "You are my hero." "Just doing my job, Mrs. Chen," Danny replied. "Same as always." The next evening at 6:47 p.m., Danny climbed the stairs to apartment 4B with Mrs. Chen's usual order. Sweet and sour chicken, no vegetables, extra rice. She was waiting at the door with her usual smile, but now there was something different in her eyes, the look of someone who knew she was protected by someone very special. The tip was $5 instead of $2, and the gratitude was worth more than any medal he'd ever received in uniform. Danny Rodriguez continued delivering food across the city, but now the neighborhood knew him as something more than just another delivery driver. He was their guardian, their protector, the man who had chosen to serve in a different way, but had never stopped being a warrior when it mattered most. Daniel Ramirez never needed a uniform to be a warrior, never needed recognition to know his worth, and never needed orders to do what was right. He found meaning in service itself, whether leading SEAL operations against terrorists or delivering food to people who needed simple kindness in their daily lives. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about what people do when everyone's watching. They're about what people do every single day when no one's paying attention. The quiet warriors who walk among us, carrying skills and courage we never think to ask about, ready to act when protection is needed most. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Daniel Ramirez? Someone whose humble work concealed extraordinary training and the ability to save lives when it mattered most? Share their name in the comments. Tell us how they taught you that heroism comes in many forms, that courage doesn't always wear the uniform you expect, and that the most important warriors are often the ones who serve without seeking recognition. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe to help us honor the quiet warriors who deserve to be remembered. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, remember, the next time you see someone doing ordinary work with extraordinary dedication, look a little closer. You might be standing next to a warrior.